All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi green juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi green juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 368. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to help support and inspire new trauma workers through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. Thanks so much for joining me today, and here we go. All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi green juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's ORGANIFI.com/trauma and use the code trauma. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Duane France. Duane, welcome.
Thank you, Guy. Thanks for having me.
All right. So Duane France is a retired United States Army non-commissioned officer. After 22 years of service, which included tours of duty with the 82nd Airborne Division, service as an Army recruiter at Fort Meade, Maryland, and 5 combat and operational deployments, he became a clinical mental health counselor serving veterans in Colorado Springs, Colorado. As he started to work with veterans, he realized there were some common challenges that all veterans face. As a result, Duane started the Headspace and Timing blog, as well as a podcast to help amplify this message and support those who have served. All right, Duane. So before we get going here, share with the listeners where you're from and where you're calling from, and then let's do it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Like many citizens of Colorado, I am not from Colorado. Very rarely do you find somebody that actually is a native. I actually grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. First a little bit inside the city, and then moved to the county, the suburbs, and then joined the Army. Lived in Army land for, like you said, 22 years. Wow. And then my family have been here in Colorado since 2006, and we've made Colorado Springs our home.
Awesome. All right. So how, after 22 years, are we talking? How did you get to this point?
That's always a great question, and it's interesting. It's an interesting story because I was not a mental health professional when I was in the military. You'll find a bunch of there's really 2 camps, I think, from former military mental health professionals, those that actually did it when they were in the service, either as a mental health technician or a clinician themselves. But then there's those of us that pivoted after the military. And as I was getting ready to retire, about 4 or 5 years, I was thinking about what I wanted to do sort of when I grew up and when I was out of the military. And more I realized that I wanted to continue to serve, but in a different way. And it's always interesting how serendipity works. I was coming back from my first deployment in Iraq. We had gotten back after 15 months. And I had already started an associate's degree. I really wanted a degree with the least amount of math possible. So I found a counseling. But even then, I didn't think that I wanted to be a mental health counselor. I thought that I'd be like a high school teacher or something. But then sitting in a reintegration briefing, I had the benefit of who I consider a mentor. She started me on this path, Cheryl McClendon, who was a retired Air Force officer and who was a licensed clinical social worker at our local veterans, our local vet center. And she just casually mentioned, hey, if anybody's interested in psychology, consider a career in the mental health field because there's not enough combat veterans who are mental health professionals. And that was sort of like a stone that dropped into the well of my mind. Started looking around, and about the same time in Colorado Springs, they started the Veterans Court, and I saw those veterans, justice-involved veterans, and I said, they'll probably need a guy who understands where they're coming from. And that's really where it started. My graduation coincided with my military retirement, and just kind of been doing this ever since.
So, and how long ago was that?
So I finished my degree in May of 15, but I really started working obviously with master's level. So I've been working with veterans, both practicum internship, but I've been doing direct therapy with veterans for just over 5 years now.
Okay, so not every, as you said, not everyone who is in the service becomes a mental health professional. Why did you do? What got you into it? Aside from you wanted to say peace out with math, but what kind of pulled you in that direction? And I understand this mentor kind of dropped the stone in a sense, but beyond that.
Right. No, and that's always and this is the thing. Research shows serendipity. The chance encounter has to meet a willing mind, and I saw that I was in logistics in the military, didn't want to do that, but one of the things I really valued when I was in the Army was the opportunity to be a mentor, be a leader, and in many ways, what I'm doing now is an extension of what I did as a leader. Taking care of troops and all that. But even before that, my father, 3 of my uncles were Vietnam veterans, and I grew up seeing what the impact of Vietnam had on each one of them. It was actually very different impact on all 4 of them, spanning the gamut. But growing up with my father, who struggled with PTSD, depression, significant substance abuse, alcoholism, and things like that, is seeing what that happened. Then I joined the Army in 92, and so I spanned both pre and post 9/11, and I started seeing the same thing in even in myself, but definitely in the soldiers that I served with, and I realized that of course I couldn't be my father's therapist or my uncle's therapist, but I could maybe help this generation keep from that kind of stuff happening to me like it did to them.
So you kind of alluded to your own experience. Can you share a little bit about that? I mean, what was your own experience in terms of how combat and serving affected or impacted you?
Yeah, no, that's also an interesting question. And really, I always kind of explain it, one of Jung's archetypes was the wounded healer, right? And so when Jung sort of looked around and he was sort of developing his concept of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, he saw that many of his fellow clinicians who were doing good work were working with individuals who had overcome their own concerns, right? So if it was hysteria, they'd overcome it. And actually, some of the worst clinicians were those that were helping people and hadn't dealt with their own issues. And so some of it has to be with, it's 1 Iraq, 2 Afghanistan deployments. You don't come out of that, being unscathed. So it definitely, there is some traumatic stress reaction that's related to that. I'm not too fond of cornfields and full moons, because every time we went out at night, and that's when most of our patrols were done, and it was a full moon, and the enemy would use the cornfields to sort of sneak up on us. So I don't like driving through Kansas at night. That's pretty much off the table. But so there's those kind of things, but also I experienced that level of reintegration. There wasn't a year of between 2006 and 2013 where I wasn't gone for all or part of the year. And so this constant rotation of coming back, fitting back into the family, leaving the family, going back in and back forth. So there was just that disruption of family life, and just the inevitable change that comes with that kind of rotation. And struggled with depression. Sure, that's something again that may have always been there throughout my life, and then the military sort of exacerbated it. But these are things that, again, the wounded healer thing, kind of taking care of my own issues, especially making sure that I do that before I help veterans with theirs.
So when you came out and decided, you wanted to get into the mental health field, was it from the get-go your decision to help other veterans? Yeah,
actually, 100%. It was I was doing some various internship sites, and uniquely enough, I was working with a local program here, the Pikes Peak Suicide Prevention Partnership, and the director, called me one day, and she was like, "Hey, I have a client for you. He's a 16-year-old, who's struggling with some stuff," and I was like, "No, thank you. Give me a three tour combat vet all day long, but I'm not sure I'm gonna, and so it was for me." And this is again as veterans, and now I mentor other veterans who are emerging into the field. One camp of thought is that, well, the veteran piece, so sort of look around and see if there's other aspects of mental health that you might enjoy. But from the very beginning, and from my the agency that I still work for now, where I had conducted my pre-graduate work, they were already working with the justice-involved veterans that I saw back in 2009, and I sort of walked into that directly, and have been doing that ever since.
There's a common thought, and I guess to a certain degree is a reality that mental health there's a stigma, right? How did you and are you dealing with that?
So even when I was in active duty, I always tried to combat that stigma within my own platoon, within my own unit and stuff. Trying to make mental health as equal as physical health. But there is this culture, right? It's I drive a Jeep, right? And Jeeps are like Legos for big kids, right? You put stuff on and take stuff off, and so my Jeep is pretty recognizable. When I was active duty, it would have been more appropriate, so to speak, for my Jeep to be sitting outside a strip club or a bar than to be seen sitting outside of a mental health counseling agency. And it's something backwards about that, right? I'm happily married, and so arguably sitting outside a bar in a strip club is not good for me, whereas sitting outside of a mental health agency is. And so really I prefer to kind of bring that head on. And there's been a lot of research around how veterans apply stigma to themselves. They'll actually apply stigma more to themselves than they will to their fellow veterans. Like they'll say that other people will think I'm weak for me going to seek help, but I won't think other people are weak. I want them to go seek help. And so there's the internal stigma against seeking help versus the sort of the cultural stigma against seeking help. And I'm actually starting to see that shift a little bit in the clients that I work with. Most post 9/11 veteran clients that I see are looking for help, 10, 12 years after the incident, whereas I work with Vietnam veterans that aren't seeking help until 30, 40, 50 years now after that. So I think there is a shift, but that's really what I'm trying to do with the blog and podcast, is just change the way that we think and talk about it.
So you said even when you were in the service, you were addressing mental health and physical health, or trying to kind of treat them equally in a sense. So it sounds like you had an increased self-awareness of the value of mental health from early on. This wasn't something that kind of clicked for you when you got out, correct?
Right. And I think in what I'm specifically thinking of, and I was a platoon sergeant in Afghanistan, then after that I was a first sergeant. By that time I had already started down the path of I was in a bachelor's of science in psychology, and I kind of already knew what I was trying to do. And there was this idea, even going back to Meekenbaum and the stress inoculation concept of, if we can prepare ourselves for things rather than react to things, it's much better. But then even it's the value, the benefit of seeing what the long-term impact in the response to combat is from my own father. One of the things that he did before I went to Iraq, which was my first combat deployment, was he said, "Hey, when you get back, make sure you talk to your wife," because that's one of several different things that broke down between he and my mom. But him saying, look, don't keep it in, don't bottle it up. Make sure that you talk about it, and then being able to. I remember very clearly. I had a great platoon leader, outstanding guy, love him to death. still to this day. But Blake and I were driving through our fob one day, and I asked him, I was like, do you tell your wife about this? He's like, nah, she doesn't need to know it. And I was able to again, provide that same thing. It's like, you got to talk about it, sir. Don't talk about it now, but eventually you're going to have to go back and you're going to have to have this conversation, or else things are going to go off the rails. And so, yeah, I think even then I understood the benefit of being of psychological health as well as, all the other things that we need to take care of.
I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Duane France, pardon me. His blog is Headspace and Timing, and he also has a podcast. So talk about why and when you started the blog and the podcast.
Yeah, this has really been a sort of an evolution. I started off with the blog specifically in January of 2016, so it's going on 3 years now, surprisingly. Like you had mentioned in the beginning, I noticed that there was not a lot of discussion about veteran mental health, and it was always this in our career field, in the mental health field, we sort of believe in our product behind closed doors, but there wasn't a lot of outreach going on. And so I was trying to do a lot of, normalizing the experience for veterans, sort of trying to draw the veil back. But also it was my own journey. This is, something that when you get out of the military, you have to find something to occupy your time, because the military leaves a pretty big hole in your life. And writing is something that I had always done, and I got away from it for a very long time. But as a teenager and as a young soldier, I had done it quite a bit. And so it was something that I realized I had come back to, that I enjoyed quite a bit. And I got some good response, and had some veterans say, look, this has really helped me out, to go seek help on my own, military spouses to help them understand what their veteran is going through. So I did that about the fall of 16. I had some invitations to go on podcasts, and I was like, "What are podcasts?" I had no clue what they were at that point. Right. And I was like, "Oh, this is a real thing." And so I was talking about mental health on several veteran-focused podcasts, and then a group of guys who had their own podcast, the Change Your POV podcast. They wanted to do something a little different, and they wanted to address all different aspects of military transition. So they invited me on as part of a network, and that was July 4th, 2017, was the original podcast, or was the first launch of the podcast. And again, it was trying to highlight the work of other people in the field, and so I've been doing both the blog and the podcast since then. We're about to hit our 100th episode, a third of where you're at, of course, but you give me a goal to shoot for.
Well, congratulations, man, on that. That is awesome, and it's so exciting, and it's just inspiring to hear you, have that experience in service and transition to help others. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like bringing people like you on, because what you're doing is so goddamn inspiring. Let me ask you this, Duane. To what degree is it, or has it been, challenging for you to share your own story on the blog or in the podcast?
I don't know that it's necessarily been that challenging. It's number one, being transparent. This is one thing as a clinician is, how much do we self-disclose, right? We're not, and this is especially when I, as a combat vet, sit with another combat vet. As a clinician, I have to be very careful to make sure that it's not just two guys shooting the breeze. Mm-hmm. And so in my clinical work, I have to be very focused on, self-disclosure in order to be able to illustrate a point or something like that. I'm not just telling stories to tell stories. And I think I carry that over in the blog and the podcast, to be able to say is usually when I talk about my story, it is to make it relatable to the listener or the reader, or things like that. But there's definitely times where I've drawn on my own experience and seen how my experiences are also common amongst other veterans, to be able to illustrate, the concepts of moral injury or the need for purpose and meaning, or just how to deal with failure and rejection, right? Because interestingly enough, and this may be telling, that the most popular blog post so far is a post about what lessons I learned from failing Jumpmaster School. In the Army, Jumpmaster School is a 3-week course, and it took me 9 months to pass it. I went through it a couple of different times, and so this idea of how do you deal with failure and how do you deal with the challenges, and so usually the talking about my own experience is really to illustrate a point to help others understand.
Granted, your role, you're in a different role now, right? You're not in the service, you're a clinician. And I'm thinking of stigma within the military. What do you think about you? What is it about you, Duane, that's allowing you to do this?
I hadn't considered it. I think it's one of those things of, and like I mentioned before, just kind of taking care of the troops. In the Army, we have the creed of non-commissioned officers, and there's a line in there that says, "My two basic responsibilities will always be uppermost in my mind: the accomplishment of my mission and the welfare of my soldiers." Sometimes in the military, those two things are mutually exclusive. But now I consider my mission to be the welfare of the veterans that I work with. And I actually had somebody that I was talking to yesterday. She was like, why do you do this? And a mentor of mine. And it's not that it's lucrative, but it's fulfilling and it's satisfying just to be able to know that, again, that serendipity of somebody could come across something that I wrote or a guest that I had on at the right time to hear the right thing that they needed it, to maybe say, this mental health thing, I do need to reach out. And that's the big issue is, and as well as I do, is clinicians, as therapists, if we were medical doctors, we'd be emergency room doctors, right? Our clients are coming in with, death of 1,000 cuts. And really the goal is to get, ahead of the blast and before the crisis and help people, develop this strength before the wheels fall off the wagon to keep it from even getting that far.
Most of the people that you're seeing, and I know it's, you can't generalize, but I'm going to take a shot at it here. Are most of the veterans you're seeing or who are coming to you, are they coming like it's the last straw, or are they coming, at what point are you seeing them?
And I think it's shifted really over the last several years. Usually it's one of three things: either imminently before a crisis, during a crisis, or after a crisis, right after something has happened. And especially when I first started working with justice-involved veterans, another mentor of mine is fond of saying that veterans, and this may be true for everyone, but people seek treatment for one of three reasons, right? Their lawyer, their lover, or their liver. So whether it's their health comes in and or their spouse and says, look, something's going to happen, or justice involvement. And so very much the for the first several years that I worked is these veterans who found themselves in the back of a cop car for whatever reason, usually and majority of it for these veteran court programs because of something that specifically happened when they were in the military. So then it was definitely, again, the wheels had fallen off the wagon, and how do we put them back on? But then slowly over time, as hopefully we're trying to maybe turn the corner on some of this discussion, people are coming in and saying, things aren't quite right. Like I go to the dentist, for a toothache before it becomes a root canal. I'm seeing some soldiers and even some spouses that are saying, things aren't working too great. Let's go in and address this before it becomes an issue rather than afterwards.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, addressing mental health while you're, in the service, how is that being done now? And you talked about it yourself. You kind of had that self-awareness to look at mental health and physical health kind of equally through the similar lens in a sense. But as a whole, what do people need to know? How is it being addressed now or not addressed?
So, and to caveat that I'm not active duty and haven't been in 5 years, and that's almost like a decade, in the military sense. But I did see things. I first started to deploy in 2006, and things were dealt with a certain way there. But by the time I had my first Afghanistan deployment in 2009, the Army, at least, and I believe the other services, they actually started embedding mental health professionals actually in the units and deploying them with the units. One of the guests I've had on my show, again, a great mentor, and we gather mentors, but Katie Kopp was a psychologist that was in our unit, in our battalion, in our brigade. And she was right there with us, and many times, I'd pull into some random combat outpost, and there she'd be, like, how'd you get there? And so the Army has done a lot, and the military has done a lot with embedded behavioral health, actually having them in the unit and making it more of a normalized process. And then just things had changed. It really peaked around 2014, 2015 when the need very well outstripped the demand. But the military has established a pretty robust level of behavioral health now. But then, does everything always manifest itself, immediately when you're in the service? I think one of the things that was found since Vietnam is the symptoms really don't show up until 15, 20 years after, the end of the era of the combat. So, we're actually probably, looking, at a groundswell of people seeking services, because right now Vietnam veterans didn't start seeking services until the mid 80s, 15 years after, to the 90s, even into the 2000s. And so if that pattern holds true, then it's really going to be needing to prepare for a tsunami, in the coming years, outside the military.
As we kind of wind down here, a lot of the people who are listening to this podcast are newer clinicians and a lot with experience too, people who are really focusing on trauma. For those people who are interested in working with veterans, a veteran population, what would you say to them? What are some of the things that maybe they should consider or learn, etc.? Where would you point them?
Well, I think that, and we talk a lot in the mental health field about making sure that we're culturally competent, right? If we're working with a certain segment of population, or we're working with foreign refugees, we need to ensure that we are culturally competent and aware of their unique needs. But a lot of people don't necessarily connect that to the military, right? Because you're a guy from the Midwest. You were from St. Louis. I definitely have to. I was from Missouri, but not rural Missouri. I'm a city boy, right? But everybody's like, but the military is a separate culture in and of itself. By everything that defines a culture: language, dress, method of communicating, transmitting information through the generations. The military is its own separate culture. I often describe it as if I went to go live in Ireland for 22 years, I spoke the same language, but I'm actually going to come back with a different set of thinking and being and way of talking. And so if anybody is actually... You can't just say, trauma's trauma, especially with veterans, because yes, there is PTSD from natural disasters and vehicle accidents and things like that. But there are so many other things that include, that veteran mental health requires information about. And so really, if you want to work with veterans, just like you want to work with any specific population, and this is especially first responders as well, is to understand the culture, take the time to learn the culture. Don't have your clients teach you the culture, but actually go out and learn and listen and understand. And number one, even be prepared. Not everybody can sit with a veteran and work with a veteran. So make sure that you feel like you can sit in and listen to some of these stories, because if you can't, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just not where your clinical space is. To just do some research and be prepared.
In terms of the podcast, you said you're kind of approaching, I'm kind of looking there right now. What are you at, 95?
95 was released today.
Okay, awesome. So you're doing once a week?
This is I am doing once a week, okay. and because I'm a glutton for punishment, actually I'm planning on, after my 100th episode, it's actually going to be twice a week, because there is such a demand, and the guests, because again, you know this as well as I do, clinicians are not used to talking about this, and so I've got enough guests that we're going to start doing. I'm going to get to 200 twice as fast as I got to 100.
Well, awesome. All right, man. So let's close out here with a book recommendation, whether combat related or not, or trauma related or not. Anything you want to recommend?
Yes, and I'm gonna cheat,
right.
And I'm actually going to do two books, because Colonel Dave Grossman, not a combat veteran himself, but has done extensive research, and he wrote two books, On Combat and On Killing. I think On Killing was the first one, and then On Combat was the extension of the second one. And both of these, I recommend them, even for those veterans who want to be mental health professionals, or anybody that wants to understand military psychology to a greater degree. On Killing very much more focuses on how what it takes to turn somebody that's not used to engaging in direct combat, and how the military develops that, and some of the psychological impacts of that. And then On Combat is much more general about how combat impacts military and veteran mental health. And so Dave Grossman's books are the two that I recommend to anybody that wants to learn more about veteran mental health.
Okay.
And then, and of course, there's mine, so I could recommend
definitely.
Mine too, I guess.
We'll have that up here too.
Yeah.
Let me see here. So that's On Combat, the psychology and physiology of deadly conflict in war and in peace, and then On Killing, the psychological cost of learning to kill in war and society, by Dave Grossman. And then share with our listeners your book. I'll have that listed up here at the show notes page.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So I actually have an ebook, which was the first one, but then we released the paperback last year, which is really a compilation of the of some of the blogs put together in a paperback form. But the main book now is Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy, and it's available on Amazon, and they can get it on the website as well.
Awesome. All right, man. So once again, speaking with Duane France, I'll have everything listed up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Congratulations on the success of your podcast and your blog, and what you're doing is beyond inspiring. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
All right, take care. All right, guys, this episode is sponsored by Trauma Therapist 2.0, community to educate, support, to inspire new trauma healers. If you're a new trauma worker, new trauma provider and healer, just starting out on this trauma-informed journey, and you're tired of doing this alone and looking for support, looking to be around a community of other passionate trauma clinicians, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 at traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist2.com. CPTSD Foundation provides peer-led support and adjunctive care in between therapy sessions for survivors of complex trauma. 7 days a week, 365 days a year, survivors come together to give and receive support and validation and feel equipped with the knowledge and skills they can use every single day. Learn more at cptsdfoundation.org. That's cptsdfoundation.org.